Welcome to the Epochlands. Tonight, as you settle in, allow your mind to drift across a quiet stretch of dark water. The air is cool, the waves are gentle, and in the middle of San Francisco Bay, there is a small island rising out of the water like a shadow. This is Alcatraz. Once it was the most feared prison in the United States, a place designed to hold the men other prisons could not control. A place built on the idea that escape was impossible. And yet, one night in June 1962, 3 men slipped out of their cells, climbed to the roof, reached to the shoreline, and disappeared into the bay. No one has ever proved what happened to them. As you listen, there is nothing you need to do, no decisions to make. Just follow the story slowly, like a tide moving in and out. To understand how that escape became possible, we have to go back to the beginning. Long before the headlines, long before the myths, there was only a lonely rock in the water, a fort, a military prison, and then a federal idea, a prison so secure, so strict, and so isolated that it would break the will of the most determined men. That idea became Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. And for almost 30 years, it stood in the bay, watching the city lights, holding men in steel and concrete. But walls never completely defeat imagination. Even on an island like this, some minds keep working, keep planning, keep dreaming. And on that quiet June night, 3 of those minds put their plan into action. Before we get there, let yourself step slowly into the past. Long before it was a prison, Alcatraz was simply an island with a view. Sailors saw it as they entered the bay. Winds wrapped around it. Waves broke at its base. In the mid-1800s, as California became more important and San Francisco grew, the United States Army looked at that isolated rock and saw a different use. They built a fort. Heavy guns pointed out toward the open ocean. Watchposts scanned the horizon. The island became part of a defensive ring around the bay. But warfare changed. The danger of foreign fleets grew smaller. The value of heavy cannon faded. The island, however, remained useful. It was close to the city, but separate from it. Hard to reach, but not too far. Surrounded by cold waters and unpredictable currents. And so slowly its purpose shifted. Instead of pointing guns out, the island began to hold people in. First, it became a military prison. Soldiers who disobeyed orders, deserted, or committed crimes in uniform were shipped out to the island. They slept behind simple bars. They marched in lines. They followed strict routines. Then, in the early 20th century, something new rose in the center of the island. A massive concrete building, taller and more imposing than anything that had stood there before. This was the main cell house, 600 cells arranged in long tiers, rows of bars, concrete floors, high ceilings, and echoing corridors. At the time it was built, it was one of the largest reinforced concrete buildings in the world. The island now had bones of stone. For a while, the military continued to use it as their prison, but the country was changing. So was crime. In the 1920s and 1930s, the United States saw the rise of organized crime and highly skilled bank robbers. Robbers who planned escapes with the same care that others planned the heists themselves. Newspapers filled with names like Al Capone and Machine Gun Kelly. Gangsters who treated prison transfers like disruptions, not endings. Public fear grew. Pressure on the government increased. There was a need for a place that stood above all other prisons. A final stop. A symbol that said, "This is as far as you go." When officials looked out at San Francisco Bay, that small rock began to look once again like an answer. In 1934, Alcatraz changed hands. It stopped being a military prison. It became a federal penitentiary. From that moment, it was no longer just a prison building. It was a message. Imagine you are a prisoner in the 1930s. Maybe you robbed banks. Maybe you ran with a crew. Maybe you escaped from another prison, or at least tried. You arrive at a federal facility. You cause trouble. You don't follow orders. You fight or run or plan too loudly. One day, a guard tells you, "If you keep this up, we'll send you to Alcatraz." At first, it sounds like a threat, a story designed to scare you, and then slowly you start seeing certain men disappear. Troublemakers, escape artists, those who hurt guards or who led riots. Word filters back. They're on the rock now. Alcatraz was not intended to hold all federal inmates. It was designed to hold a particular group, those the system found the hardest to control. The men who assaulted staff, the ones who kept escaping, the ones who turned other prisons into training grounds. Life in Alcatraz followed a different philosophy. You were not sent there to be comfortable. You were not sent there to socialize. You were sent there to be contained. On the island, prisoners were given 4 basic rights: food, shelter, clothing, medical care. Everything else was a privilege. The right to work had to be earned. The right to send or receive letters was controlled. The right to edge away from total isolation came slowly, if at all. Early on, there was even a rule that almost no one on the outside truly understood. In the cell house, prisoners were not supposed to talk. For hours every day, men ate meals side by side without speaking. They walked in lines, listening to the shuffle of shoes and the distant sounds of the bay, but not to each other's voices. In their cells, talking was limited and carefully watched. The silence was meant to prevent plotting. It also had another effect. It got inside their heads. Some men learned to endure it. They read. They exercised in their tiny cells. They focused on routines. Others began to fracture under the strain. Simple. Conversations became rare and precious. A whispered word in the yard. A nod. A few syllables traded on the way to work. The silence rule was eventually relaxed. But by then, the reputation of Alcatraz was set. It was not just a place of stone and iron. It was a place where the system tried to control every movement, every word, every small act of resistance. And yet, even in a place like this, the one thing no one could fully contain was thought. Men watched. They listened. They learned the rhythms of the place. They felt the wind shifting outside their barred windows. They saw the city lights glittering across the water at night. They heard boat horns echo through the fog, and some of them began to think, if someone could get out of here, how would it be done? Alcatraz was designed to be escape-proof. High walls, guard towers with rifles, strict schedules, frequent headcounts. And beyond the stone, the bay itself seemed to finish the job. The water around the island is cold, even in summer. Currents move with the tides in complex patterns. Winds can push small boats and swimmers off course. The distance to shore is not huge when you look at it on a map, but in that water in the dark, for a tired, underfed prisoner, it becomes something else. Despite all of this, thoughts of escape never completely disappeared. They passed from man to man in low voices. They hid inside rumors. They surfaced in the quiet moments when men stared at the ceiling in their cells, imagining paths through the walls. Over the years, some prisoners did more than think. They tried. The first attempts were clumsy, desperate, or half-planned. A prisoner climbed a fence near the incinerator and was shot. Some believed he was trying to escape. Others said he simply misunderstood an order and paid with his life. 2 other prisoners soared through bars in an older industrial building, slipped into the fog one December day, and vanished into the water. Search teams found nothing conclusive. Officials believed they drowned. Some inmates chose to believe the opposite, that the 2 men reached shore and vanished into the world. It almost didn't matter which was true. What mattered was the possibility. In the cramped, watched, silent spaces of the rock, possibility was powerful. It meant the prison was not perfect. It meant the island was not a sealed world. Other attempts were violent and tragic. A group of prisoners, armed with tools and stolen weapons, tried to seize control of the cell block, grab hostages, and make it to the dock. The plan failed. The prison exploded into a 2-day battle. Guards and prisoners were killed. Surviving inmates were tried and, in some cases, executed. The message from the administration was clear. Try to run, and you will pay heavily. But in another way, every attempt, successful or not, also told a quieter story. It showed where the lines were weakest. It revealed which parts of the prison were older, less reinforced, less watched. It showed that Alcatraz could be studied like any other system. The walls were thick, but they still had seams. One day, 3 men and a 4th accomplice would begin to trace those seams very carefully. The story of the 1962 escape centers around 3 main figures, and a 4th man whose role is just as important. Their names were Frank Lee Morris, John Anglin, Clarence Anglin, and Alan West. Each of them had traveled a long road before reaching the island. Frank Morris was born in 1926. His childhood was unstable, filled with foster homes and brief stretches of life on the outside that ended in trouble. By his teenage years, he was already familiar with cells and concrete. Petty crimes grew into more serious offenses: robbery, possession of weapons, breaking and entering. Wherever he was sent, one pattern repeated. He tried to escape. He cut through bars. He chipped at walls. He studied routines. He used his mind as much as his hands. Eventually, the federal system had seen enough. A man who would not settle down inside a regular penitentiary, who kept testing the bars, who refused to accept his sentence as the end of movement, was exactly the kind of man Alcatraz was built to contain. In January 1960, Frank Morris arrived on the island. John and Clarence Anglin grew up very differently. They were 2 of 14 children in a poor farming family. They were born in Georgia and later raised in Florida. Their parents worked hard to keep food on the table. The boys worked too. They helped in the fields. They did chores. They swam in nearby lakes for fun. They were naturally strong in the water. They swam in cold conditions, even when ice formed along the edges of the lakes. Sometimes they challenged each other to see who could stay in the longest. Their school years were not kind. They were teased for their worn clothes and patched trousers. Their family did what they could, but money was always tight. Shame began to build, quietly and steadily. Eventually, the brothers began skipping classes. They spent more time by the water, more time out of sight, more time together than apart. Small thefts followed. Robberies grew bolder. In 1958, John, Clarence, and an older brother, Alfred, robbed a bank in Alabama. They stole over $18,000, a significant sum for a small town. They fled, but their escape did not last. They were arrested and each sentenced to 35 years. At first, they were sent to other federal prisons, including the one in Atlanta. Even there, the pattern continued. Attempts to escape, plans uncovered, warnings issued. Officials eventually decided to move them to tougher facilities, first Leavenworth, and, for John and Clarence, ultimately to Alcatraz. John arrived at the Rock in late 1960. Clarence followed in early 1961. On the island, the brothers were separated into different cells, but remained close in spirit. They were quiet, polite to staff, but behind their calm faces they carried the same determination that had driven them since childhood. They did not want to die behind bars. The 4th man, Alan West, had a history of burglaries and constant trouble with prison authorities. He had already been on Alcatraz for years by the time the others arrived. West knew the building. He knew which officers paid attention and which did not. He knew the sound of every key and gate. He was hot-headed, sometimes difficult, but he had one thing that would prove invaluable. He had noticed something about the structure of the prison itself. Bringing these 4 men together took time and circumstance. They had all spent time in some of the same institutions before. They understood each other's backgrounds. They shared the same basic instinct to look for a way out, no matter how high the walls. Once they were all on the island, they began, very quietly, to move toward each other. Frank Morris was first given work in the prison library. It seemed like a simple assignment. He helped organize books. He signed out reading material to other inmates. He moved in and out of the cell house on a predictable schedule. But the library was also a place where long-term inmates passed through regularly. Men who had watched the workings of Alcatraz for years. Men who knew where old concrete met new, where original bars had been replaced and where they had not. From them, Morris learned more than just titles and authors. He learned pieces of the layout. He learned which parts of the prison dated back to military days and which were part of later upgrades. He learned who might be willing to quietly share observations and who might talk too much. Alan West, meanwhile, worked on various maintenance crews. At one point, he was assigned to painting cells and to work in areas close to the top of the cell house. From his position, he noticed something that just looked different. Behind the rows of cells, there was a narrow, unseen world, a service corridor. It carried pipes and electrical conduits and air ducts. The walls that separated each cell from this corridor were made of older concrete that had started to weaken over time. And higher up, near the roof, there were ventilator openings that could, in theory, lead outside. In most prisons, such observations might remain idle. On Alcatraz, in the mind of a man like West, they became something more. West eventually brought what he had noticed to Frank Morris. The idea was simple but ambitious. If they could dig out the areas around the ventilation openings in the backs of their cells, they could slip into the service corridor. From there, they might be able to climb upward, reach the space above the cell blocks, and work toward one of the ventilation shafts on the roof. Morris listened. He weighed the risks, the noise, the time, the chances. Slowly, a more detailed plan formed. For any such plan to work, they needed several things to happen in the right order. They needed to be in cells that shared the same service corridor. They needed tools suitable for cutting and scraping concrete. They needed a place to hide what they built. And finally, they needed a means to leave the island itself. Cell assignments on Alcatraz could be changed, but not at will. Still, over time, through routine transfers and quiet requests that did not draw attention, the men moved closer together on B Block. Eventually, Morris, John, Clarence and West all had cells that backed onto the same hidden space. They now shared not only the same row, but the same secret corridor. Around them, the routines of the island continued as before. Counts, meal lines, work assignments, lock-ins. On the surface, nothing looked unusual, but inside those 4 neighbouring cells, something slow and careful had begun. Waliving Wom. By the time all 4 men were on the rock together, Alcatraz looked on the surface exactly as it always had. The fog still slid past the windows in slow grey sheets. The bay was still cold and dark. The city still glowed faintly across the water, close enough to see and yet impossibly far away. Counts were called at the same hours. Keys turned in the same locks. Steel doors opened and closed with the same heavy echo. But behind that routine, something quiet had begun to change. 4 men were watching more closely than most. 4 men were listening, measuring, and storing away tiny details. They were not just serving time anymore, they were working on a problem. Frank Morris had always studied places. He studied them the way some people study books or music. He paid attention to the way footsteps travelled through hallways, to the routes guards chose when they walked, to the places where echoes sounded softer or louder than they should. On Alcatraz, he did the same thing. At first, he did it alone. His days began like everyone else's. An early morning, a head count, the clatter of trays in the mess hall, the slow shuffle of prisoners moving from one assignment to another. He walked in line, eyes straight ahead, but his mind was always slightly above, slightly beyond, looking at the whole pattern. The library job suited him. Shelving books and managing loans did not look like much, but it gave him a vantage point. Inmates from every block passed by. Some had arrived years before him. Some were nearing the end of their sentences. Some had grown so used to the rock that they carried in their heads the entire map of the place. Frank listened. He listened to short comments about how things used to be, about doors that had once been in a different spot, about floors that had been cut and rebuilt, about walls that had been thicker or thinner. He listened to men who remembered the old industrial building at the north end of the island, now mostly abandoned. He listened to men who had worked in the cell house during repairs. He listened to those who had nothing left to lose and were willing to talk as long as the topic stayed vague enough to avoid trouble. He never pushed. He didn't act eager. He let details come to him. He learned that the huge concrete box of the cell house had layers. There were the obvious layers everyone saw: ground floor, ranges of cells, the wide central corridor. But there were also hidden layers. Behind each row of cells, there was a narrow world of pipes and ducts, a service corridor that only maintenance crews used. Above the cell blocks, between the tops of the tiers and the roof, there was another hidden space, hot in summer, cold in winter, dimly lit, partly occupied by ducts and beams, partly forgotten. If there was any way out of Alcatraz that did not go through a guarded gate, it would have to pass through those unseen spaces. Frank knew this in theory. Alan West, paint-splattered and restless, soon gave him something more than theory. West moved differently in the prison. Where most inmates followed their assigned paths and tried to attract as little attention as possible, he was constantly being loaned out. He painted walls. He helped repair pipes. He moved through areas that ordinary prisoners saw only from a distance. He was not loved by the guards. He had a sharp tongue, a quick temper, and a reputation for stirring up trouble. But he did his work, and while he worked, he saw things. One day, while painting near the top of B Block, West's eyes followed a line of pipe upwards toward the ceiling. Behind the tiers, behind the neat row of barred fronts, a narrow passage rose toward the roof. The walls there were not smooth and strong like the outer shell of the prison. They were older, patched, pitted by time. Around each small ventilation opening in the back of the cells, the concrete seemed slightly softer, as if it had not been poured with the same care as the rest. West touched one of these places with the edge of a tool, more out of habit than intention. A tiny flake came away. Not much, but enough to prove that this was not solid granite, not steel, not something that would resist every tool. It was just aging concrete. For a man whose thoughts always leaned toward escape, this was not just an observation. It was an invitation. The first time West brought this to Frank, it was not during some dramatic secret meeting in the dark. It was during a small, ordinary moment, folded into the day. Perhaps it was in the chow hall, during one of those brief minutes when men could sit and eat in relative calm. Perhaps it was near the library gate, as West passed with a can of paint in his hand and a guard watching from the end of the corridor. It would have been done casually. A sentence here, a phrase there. West shared what he had seen. The service corridor behind the cells, the aging concrete around the vents, the way the space above the tiers might be reached if someone could slip through those openings. He did not have to spell out the rest. Frank understood immediately. It was not enough to know. There was weak concrete. They needed to answer a series of harder questions. Could a man carve enough concrete away from one of those vents to fit his shoulders through? Could he do it without the guards noticing, without the dust giving him away? Could this be repeated in more than one cell, creating several holes, several routes into the hidden corridor? And if they reached that corridor, could they climb higher, reach the roof, and then the outside world? These were not questions to answer in one conversation. They were the beginning of a long, careful study. Escape planning in a place like Alcatraz cannot happen with long meetings and whispered conferences. Eyes are always near, ears are always listening. Instead, it happens slowly in small fragments scattered across the day. A quick glance in the yard, a short exchange as men stand in line for food, a comment that sounds like nothing to a stranger but carries meaning to someone who already knows the outline. Frank and West began to talk more often. They didn't talk about escape out loud, they talked about construction. They talked about old work and new work. They talked about bad concrete and good air. Over time, another pair of ears joined their quiet orbit. John Anglin, settled now into the routines of the rock, had kept his face calm, his body relaxed, and his head low. He'd already learned from older inmates that the first months in Alcatraz were testing months. Guards watched how you moved, how quickly you responded to orders, whether you were going to fight, argue, or comply. John did not fight. He did not argue. He watched. He watched Frank move between his cell and the library. He watched West pass by on jobs that took him into corners no ordinary inmate saw. He knew the type. He knew the look of men who were not content to simply mark days on the wall. He had been that man himself in other prisons. In the library, perhaps returning a book or picking up a new one, he would have stood close to the counter and heard little pieces of conversation. Small, technical words about vents, cement and pipes. Nothing that sounded suspicious on its own, but enough to suggest that a pattern was there. When Clarence arrived on the island, John had someone to share his observations with. The brothers did not get to choose their cells, but when they were allowed to see each other in work details or in the yard, they walked side by side, heads turned slightly down, voices low. They talked about the library, they talked about the layout of B block, they talked about the guards who seemed more relaxed, the ones who seemed more alert, the rhythms of the counts, and slowly, because time was all they had, they began to drift closer into the orbit of Frank and West. For an escape plan to be more than a fantasy, it needs a core of people who are willing to do more than talk. It needs men who can keep secrets, endure boredom, and commit to months of work for a single night of risk. On the Rock, where rumors could cost lives, trust was rare. Trust came in small tests. A warning about a strict guard passed along quietly proved truth. A bit of information about a work detail shared in confidence did not spread further. A comment made in front of others was ignored because all four understood that the plan could not live in casual conversation. There was another invisible test too. None of them wanted to harm guards or other inmates as part of their escape. Unlike earlier, violent attempts that had ended in blood, this plan had to be different. They wanted to leave the island, not turn it into a battlefield. In the controlled chaos of prison life, that kind of line, no killing, no open attack, told them something about each other. They were desperate, yes, they were prepared for risk, but they did not want to pile blood on top of all the years they already owed. That shared understanding made it easier to commit. Once they had each quietly chosen to be part of the same effort, the next practical problem was physical. They needed the right cells. In B block, not every cell backed onto the same accessible section of the service corridor. Not every vent was in the same condition. Some concrete might be stronger, some might have been patched, and even if the structure allowed it, the men needed to be close enough to each other to work together, share tools, and coordinate. Cell assignments in Alcatraz could be changed for many reasons. Sometimes a prisoner moved because of discipline issues, sometimes because of work assignments, sometimes for reasons inmates never learned. Over weeks and months, small opportunities appeared. A man was moved out of a cell, leaving it empty. Another prisoner was transferred off the island. Occasionally a guard, for reasons known only to him, reassigned two men to different positions on the tier. The four did not openly request to be together. That would have drawn attention. Instead, they nudged where they could. A quiet word with a clerk about being closer to the library. A suggestion that a move might make it easier for a man to get to his work detail on time. A behavior adjustment intended to convince certain staff that this or that placement would be better for discipline. It was slow, almost painfully so. But time on Alcatraz was something they had in abundance. Eventually, the pattern shifted in their favor. Alan West found himself with a cell that backed onto a section of the service corridor he knew. Frank Morris obtained a cell on the same row. John and Clarence were placed in neighbouring cells too, all in the same block, all facing the main corridor, but sharing the hidden world behind. From the front, the cells looked no different than any others. Narrow metal bunks, small shelves, a sink, a toilet, bars and concrete. From the back, Just beyond the thin grill of the vent was the space they needed. They could not see it yet, but they could feel it, like a pressure on the other side of a wall. As the physical arrangement fell into place, the mental work intensified. They needed tools. There was no hardware store on Alcatraz, no friendly workshop filled with spare chisels and metal drills for the taking. Everything had to be improvised, stolen, or traded for. Primarily, they needed something that could break apart old concrete quietly. A spoon is not much of a tool in most situations, but in prison, a spoon can be many things. With enough determination and time, it can be sharpened against stone, its edge turned into a thin scraping blade. A piece of metal broken off from a fan, a mop wringer, or an old tool could be shaped into something similar. These were not instant weapons or dramatic instruments. They were small, dull, ordinary objects transformed with patience into something more useful. They had another problem: sound. Chipping at concrete makes noise. In the tight acoustics of a cell block, where every small clink and scratch can travel, that noise could easily reach a watching guard's ears. Here again, the everyday routine of Alcatraz offered its own cover. At certain hours of the evening, after work assignments and before final lights out, the cell blocks were filled with a soft chaos of sounds. Men talking in low tones, sinks running, toilets flushing, radios playing from a few cells where inmates had earned that privilege, an occasional cough, laugh, or argument. Somewhere in the mix, a quiet scraping sound could be hidden if the timing was right. Frank Morris had another advantage: his accordion. It was a small thing in his cell, a trembling, reedy instrument that gave him a tiny window of escape into music. He was allowed to play it within certain limits. On some evenings, as lights dimmed and the block slid towards the enforced quiet of night, he would sit on his bunk and draw a slow, steady stream of notes from the instrument. Down the tier, a few men might mutter, some might listen, some might complain, but the sound was considered harmless. Guards heard only a prisoner whiling away his time with music. Just behind that thin music, in 3 other cells, dull spoons and bits of metal rubbed slowly against crumbling concrete. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause. A rhythm set not to the impatience of a man who wants to be free by tomorrow, but to the patience of men who understand that freedom, if it is to come, will be built grain by grain. Dust was another problem. Breaking concrete leaves traces. If fine grey powder began to collect around the vent, any guard walking past with a sharp eye might stop and look more closely. To avoid that, they used the same strategy they had used with sound: movement and disguise. Small amounts of dust could be collected in pockets during the day. It could be sprinkled discreetly into the yard during exercise, blending with the dirt underfoot. Some could be flushed away, mixed into water so that it left no obvious mark. The edges of the vents could be covered. Thin cardboard or cloth painted to match the wall could create the illusion of an untouched surface. From the central corridor, during a quick glance into each cell, a guard would see exactly what he expected to see: bars, bunk, shelf, sink, toilet, and a dull wall at the back. Only in the close, quiet intimacy of the cell itself did the difference become apparent. There, by touch more than sight, the prisoners could feel the groove growing wider around each vent. Every evening it was a little deeper. The planning did not stop at the walls. They also had to think about where they would go once they got beyond them. This part of the plan extended beyond part 6 of their story into the later stages you will hear in the following sections. But even here, in these early days of scraping and quiet preparation, the shape of the wider plan was beginning to form. Rafts made from raincoats, life vests stitched from stolen material, a route across the rooftop, down pipes, past fences, to the dark edge of the island. They did not yet have every detail settled. They did not yet know which night would finally offer the right combination of weather, timing, and courage. But each scrape of the spoon, each hidden flake of dust, each small conversation in the chow line or the yard nudged them closer. Inside B block, 4 apparently ordinary inmates moved through their days. They stood for counts, picked up food trays, went to work, returned to their cells. Guards marked them off on clipboards. Other prisoners saw them pass and did not always know how much they carried in their minds. Behind them, unseen and unheard, the old concrete was changing shape. A wall that had stood untouched for decades was slowly acquiring an opening. The rock, built to hold men still, had a weakness now, hidden in 4 quiet cells. It would take many months, and the story would stretch much further, but part 6 of their journey ends here, not with a dramatic escape, not with boats or searchlights, but with something far smaller and more patient. 4 men, in 4 narrow spaces, working in the half-dark, turning the idea of escape from a dream into an opening in the wall, small enough for a hand to pass through, and one day, a body. From the outside, Alcatraz still looked unbreakable. Inside, the weak spot had been found. Night after night, the prison moved through its mechanical rhythm, steel doors closing, boots echoing down long corridors, keys scraping against metal, the low hum of hundreds of men settling into another night on the rock. For most inmates, this was the moment the world shrank into a 6 by 9 foot cage. But for 4 men, Frank Morris, John Anglin, Clarence Anglin, and Alan West, night was becoming something else, a workshop, a battlefield, a doorway, slowly widening, grain by grain. For them, Alcatraz was no longer a fortress, it was a puzzle. And piece by piece, the puzzle was beginning to open. The early stages were the most delicate. Concrete that had been poured decades earlier had grown brittle in places. Salt air crept in from the bay, creeping through pores in the stone, weakening its interior even while the surface looked clean and solid. To a guard, the wall was simply a wall. To a prisoner with enough time, patience, and desire, it was something else entirely. Frank made the first true breakthrough. He had been studying the area around the vent for weeks, gently tapping with a spoon-sharpened edge, learning where the vibrations traveled, where the sound died, where the wall felt hollow behind the surface. One night, after the last guard's footsteps faded away, he pressed the metal edge into a small crack, prying just a little harder than before. A thin piece of concrete snapped free. No louder than a fingernail breaking, no echo, just a tiny victory held between his fingers. He did not smile, he did not gloat. He simply turned the piece over once in the dim light, feeling its brittle grain. This was all he needed to know. The wall would give way. Not quickly, not easily, but it would. Clarence was next. His wall had the same hollow sound Frank's did, a soft, almost forgotten cavity between cell and corridor. The Anglin brothers had always worked with their hands. They understood how materials responded to pressure, how force needed to flow, not strike. They treated the wall like a stubborn plank of wood, something that had to be persuaded, not attacked. Each man worked at night, scraping just enough material to widen the space behind the vent, but never enough to draw attention. If a guard flashed a light into their cell, the fake cardboard vent cover blended perfectly into the shadows. Day after day, inch by inch, the holes widened. One night, John pushed a finger through his opening and felt cold air brush against his skin. Behind the cell was the hidden service corridor, dark, dusty, silent. The exit was real. The escape was no longer theory, it was beginning. For West, things were different. His wall was thicker, poured unevenly, reinforced awkwardly, patched years earlier without much care. He worked just as hard as the others, sometimes harder, driven by a restless energy the others didn't share, but his progress was slower. His hole was smaller. The concrete seemed to resist him more stubbornly. He didn't say much about it, but the others could feel his frustration. Frank noticed it first. John noticed it next. Clarence kept quiet, but even he felt West's tension growing, knotting thicker each night like rope tightening under strain. They knew West was struggling, but they also knew the plan needed all 4 men. Without West, They would have no initial discovery of the vent. Without West, one part of the plan, the roof access, had gaps. They didn't voice it, not yet, but a shadow had formed over West's part of the plan, faint but unmistakable. Only time would show how deep that shadow would grow. By the 4th month of digging, Frank had a hole large enough to slip his shoulders through. The first time he tested the space behind the wall, he waited and listened. He placed the cardboard vent cover back in place, eased himself silently through the opening, and braced himself inside the dark corridor. For the first time since arriving on the rock, he was standing somewhere no guard expected a prisoner to be. The air behind the cells was cold and stale. A faint draft moved along the corridor, carrying the scent of dust and rusted pipes. He crouched, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness. The corridor was narrow, barely wide enough for a man to move sideways. Pipes ran along the walls like ribs inside a massive skeleton. Above him, a beam of light filtered through wooden slats and vents leading up to the top of the block. He moved slowly, mapping the space with glances and careful handholds. One wrong sound could echo, one wrong move could bring dust raining down. Frank returned to his cell after a few minutes. He replaced the vent cover, pulled his blanket over his body, closed his eyes. But sleep did not come quickly. He had seen something the others had not yet seen. The path existed. The question now was how to make it safe for all of them. Their progress depended on secrecy. Every scrap of concrete had to be removed without leaving a trace. Every tool had to be hidden in plain sight. Every sound had to be masked by something else. Frank's accordion became one of the most useful tools, not for music, but for noise. Each night, while he dug, he would play it softly, just enough to create a background hum that hid the scratching of metal on concrete. The Anglins began doing the same. Some nights they hummed quietly. Some nights they timed their scraping with the loud clatter of distant steel doors. Alan West tried to keep the same rhythm, but the resistance of his wall made the work louder, more unpredictable. John and Clarence scattered dust in the yard each morning, sprinkling it like ordinary dirt. Sometimes they flushed small amounts down the toilet. Other times they released it under workbenches during their shifts, a few grains at a time, never enough for anyone to notice. This was not dramatic work. It was not fast. It was slow erosion, the kind of change that happens gradually, so gradually that no one sees it happening, except the men who make it happen. By early spring, the corridor behind B Block began to fill with objects that should never have been there. Raincoats folded and stacked, old pieces of wood taken from shop scraps, twine, scraps of metal, pieces of cardboard, and eventually the pieces that would matter most, the early sections of the raft. The men stole raincoats over time, carefully folding them so they looked unused. Each coat was waterproof, thick rubberized canvas that could be sealed and inflated. A raft wasn't built overnight. It came together piece by piece, seam by seam, stitched with the patience of men who understood exactly how much depended on each detail. They also crafted wooden paddles, simple, sturdy, shaped just enough to push water. Every item was hidden behind the walls, invisible to guards walking past cells that looked perfectly ordinary. The secret workshop grew, quiet and unseen. The prison still believed it was impenetrable, but the space behind the cells told another story. Alcatraz was being hollowed out from the inside. As the months passed, the differences between the men became sharper. Frank remained steady, focused, thinking everything through twice before acting. The Anglin brothers worked with calm, practical efficiency. They moved like they were building another shed back home, measured, patient, unshaken. West, however, grew more anxious. He was not progressing as quickly. His hole lagged behind the others. Every night, he carved more desperately. Every morning, he hid the evidence with less precision. Frank noticed, John noticed, but saying anything was dangerous. The plan required unity. The men depended on each other. Still, cracks were forming, not in the concrete, but in their trust. Would West's wall break open in time? Would he fit? Would he panic? These questions whispered in their minds each night as they worked shoulder to shoulder through a wall, but worlds apart in silence. Once Frank mastered the corridor behind the cells, he explored upward. A narrow series of pipes and beams led toward a ventilation shaft. This shaft climbed to a wooden grate near the ceiling of the cell block, a place no prisoner was meant to reach. But prisoners are inventive. Frank measured the distance with his hands. He tested the metal grate, old wood worn by decades of humidity, softened nails, rust on the sides where the metal met the frame. It was climbable, breakable, usable. The men now had a full route: cell, hidden corridor, climb pipes, ventilation shaft, top of cell block, roof, north shore, water. It was no longer a dream. It was a map only 4 men on the island could see. With a working plan in place, the 4 men began reinforcing their partnership. They talked carefully, always in short fragments during mealtimes when guards were distracted. They confirmed tool lists, they reviewed timing, they synchronized signals. Frank reminded them, "There are no second chances on the rock." John nodded. Clarence agreed. West swallowed hard, because he knew what the others knew. If his wall didn't open in time, the whole plan could collapse. No one said it, but every man felt it. The pressure on West grew heavier each night. Soon the most important structure was nearly complete. 50 raincoats became rubber panels. Rubber panels became large sheets. Sheets became a foldable, sealable craft. A raft big enough for 4 men. A raft strong enough to survive the currents. The men tested each seam by blowing air into small test pockets. If air leaked, they patched it. If it held, they added it to the final structure. By now, the hidden corridor was a different world. It was no longer just a passage behind cells. It was a shipyard, a last refuge, a promise. By late spring, everything was nearly ready. The raft, the paddles, the life jackets, the decoy heads, the escape route. Only 2 things remained: a clear night with a favorable tide and West's stubborn wall. Every evening now carried new weight. Every count felt more dangerous. Every footstep outside the cells made their hearts tighten, because after months of silence, struggle, sweat, dust, scraping, hiding, and building, the escape was close, very close. Close enough that even the walls could feel it. Close enough that the men stopped thinking about if and started thinking about when. By the time June settled over Alcatraz, the island felt different, though nothing looked different to the guards patrolling its corridors. The routines remained the same, the counts unchanged, the lights flickering with their usual tired glow. But for the 4 men who had spent nearly a year clawing their way through concrete and secrecy, every evening carried a heaviness the guards could never sense. Something was coming, something irreversible, and the island, in its own strange way, seemed to feel it too. The days grew longer, but to Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers, sunlight meant nothing. Their world existed in the hours after lights out, those quiet moments when the prison seemed to exhale and the guards let their shoulders relax just slightly. They had memorized the rhythm of Alcatraz, the footsteps, the cough of the night officer, the metallic groan of steel cooling in sea air, the distant churn of the tide below. They understood what the guards did not. Patterns create weakness, and weakness, if studied long enough, becomes opportunity. Inside each cell, the nearly completed escape tunnels waited behind thin blankets hung carefully to hide the work. The holes were vents, in name only now, large enough for a full-grown man to squeeze through. For 3 men, at least. Alan West's opening still betrayed him. Every night, Frank listened silently to the faint scrape of West's tools, a desperate rhythm that never stopped, even when exhaustion trembled through West's hands. His wall was stubborn, as if the prison itself was trying to hold him in place even while letting the others go. Yet the clock kept ticking toward the night they all knew was coming, a night they could not postpone. 2 nights before the planned escape, Frank called the Anglin brothers to meet in the crawl space above B Block. They climbed one at a time, careful to place their feet exactly where the beams creaked the least. The attic above the cell block was a world few had ever seen. A forest of wooden beams, old pipes and forgotten structure. Dust floated like pale fog, settling on everything like a thin, ancient blanket. Frank led the way with cautious steps, his eyes adjusting quickly to the darkness. The Anglins followed closely. None of them spoke. They didn't need to. Frank reached the wooden grate that stood between them and open air. This was the barrier keeping them from the roof, just inches of old lumber and corroded screws separating captivity from possibility. He pressed gently with his fingers. The wood shifted again, just as it had the last time. But now, something changed. The edge lifted slightly. The gap widened a fraction more. It was enough. Frank exhaled. The Anglin brothers watched him, and in that silent exchange, all three men understood. The way out existed, and nothing except a misstep in timing stood in their way. Back in his cell, Alan West battled his wall like a man wrestling a ghost. Concrete dust coated his hands, his sheets, the neckline of his shirt. The hole was larger than before, but still not enough for him to pass through without scraping. Scraping meant noise, noise meant danger, danger meant failure, and failure for West meant being left behind. He knew Frank would not delay the escape for him, not because Frank lacked loyalty, but because the entire operation relied on one thing: timing. The first guard check, the second, the silence between them, the window where shadows hid everything. If they waited one night too long, a new guard rotation could appear, a new search, a random cell inspection, a glance too long at a blanket-covering event. West understood this. He chipped harder, faster, until the ragged edge of his vent finally began to thin. But something else worried him even more than the concrete: his nerves. Every time a guard passed, his breath froze. Every time metal clanged in the distance, his heart pounded so loudly he felt certain it could be heard. But he kept going. He had no choice. Freedom was coming for the others. He needed to make sure it came for him too. The raft, carefully folded, waited in the corridor behind the cells. It had taken months to construct. Layer upon layer of stolen raincoats melted and sealed into a single floating shell. It gleamed faintly, even in darkness. Next to it lay the paddles, smooth, shaped by hand, durable enough to carry 4 men across a channel that had swallowed many before them. The life vests were ready. The waterproof bags were ready. The tools were ready. And yet, none of it mattered until West finished his wall. John Anglin checked the raft each night, his fingers running over the seams with a kind of reverence. The craft represented more than escape. It represented the only real chance at life beyond the island's brutal tides. Clarence inspected the paddles again and again, sanding edges in the dark until each one felt perfectly balanced. Frank tested the homemade periscope once more, lifting it toward the wooden grate. Through its small mirrors, he could just make out the faint glow of moonlight above the roof. Everything was ready. Everything except the man still fighting the wall behind him. One of the reasons Alcatraz remained so confident in its security was because its prisoners were exhausted. Exhaustion made people predictable. It made them compliant. It made them quiet. But not these 4. Still, the guards believed that they controlled every inch of the island. They trusted in concrete and iron, in tides cold enough to numb limbs within minutes, in currents strong enough to drag a man under even if he managed to stay afloat. And their confidence grew deeper with every count that matched the one before. One night, a guard lingered outside West's cell a little too long. West froze, his hand still gripping the chisel. The guard's flashlight beam hovered across the bars, then drifted upward to the ceiling. West didn't breathe. The guard yawned, scratched his chin, and walked away. West nearly collapsed in relief. But Frank, in the next cell over, heard everything. He knew the window was closing. 2 days before the escape, the men gathered quietly in the crawl space. There was no leader giving orders, no dramatic speech, just 4 men sitting in darkness, breathing the cold air that drifted from the roof above. Frank was the first to speak. "We go tomorrow night." The Anglin brothers nodded immediately. West didn't. His voice cracked when he whispered, "My hole, it's not ready." Frank didn't answer right away. Silence stretched long. Then Frank said something in the calmest, most final tone West had ever heard. "It has to be." Clarence added, "We can't wait another week. Somebody will notice something. A guard will see dust. A vent will shift. The risk grows every day." John nodded. "If you keep working, you'll be ready." West stared at the floor, fighting the truth. He wanted to be ready. He needed to be ready. But the wall didn't care what he needed. Still, he said the only words he could. "I'll finish it." Frank placed a hand on his shoulder. "For your sake, I hope you do." Even prisoners feel the weight of a final sunset. Through tiny cell windows, little more than slits carved into concrete, they watched the sky shift from blue to gold to a faint purple that blurred into night. Some men prayed, some men slept, some cursed their fate. Frank Morris sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at the small dummy head he had crafted. Its painted eyes looked real in the dim light. Its hair, made from real hair, fell naturally across its forehead. Tomorrow, that head would lie in his bed, fooling the guard long enough to give him a running start toward the roof. The Anglin brothers rehearsed their final steps one last time, whispering every move. Blanket, vent, crawl, climb, grate, roof, north edge, raft, water, silence. West didn't rehearse. He worked, his hands blistered, his arms trembled, concrete flakes stuck to his skin like salt. Every moment brought him closer, but every moment also brought exhaustion. That night, the prison fell asleep under the slow hum of the generators and the whisper of wind scraping against metal. Inmate voices faded, lights dimmed, footsteps softened. This was the final night. The quiet felt different, thick, expectant, heavy. Frank watched the guard walk past on the last head count of the evening. The guard's flashlight drifted across each bunk, lingering just long enough to see what he expected to see. Men lying still, men dreaming of nothing, men broken by the rock. What he didn't know was that 3 of those men were wide awake, and the 4th was carving his way toward them with everything he had left in him. When the guard's footsteps faded, the prison fell into darkness, a darkness full of promise and danger, and the possibility of history being written in silence. In his cell, West pushed harder than ever. His breathing grew ragged, sweat dripped into his eyes, his fingers cramped around his tool. The hole widened, a fraction, then another, but still not enough. His stomach clenched. What if he couldn't fit? What if the others left him? What if his years of planning ended here, inches from freedom? He dug faster. A small chunk of concrete snapped loose. He dug again. Another piece fell. His heart pounded. He didn't know how much time had passed, only that the hour was slipping away. But he kept going, because stopping meant prison forever. In the crawl space above, Frank and the Anglin brothers waited in complete stillness. They listened for West's signal. Nothing. Minutes passed. Still nothing. Frank finally whispered, "It's time." John hesitated. "Should we wait?" Frank shook his head. "We can't." And so the 3 men began moving, calm, steady, deliberate. They placed their dummy heads, arranged their blankets, entered their vents, crawled into the dark corridor. Their bodies moved with practiced ease, their breaths controlled, their fear caged tightly behind discipline. Tonight was the night. There was no turning back. Inside his cell, West finally broke through enough concrete to widen the hole by another inch. Another desperately needed inch. He pressed his shoulders inside and got stuck. Panic surged through him. He tried to twist, to force himself through, to exhale and slide deeper. Nothing worked. He pushed harder, and finally, he slipped through. But when he crawled into the corridor, the others were gone. The crawl space above him was silent. The escape had begun without him. West whispered into the dark, his voice cracking, Wait, please. But only the stillness of Alcatraz answered. He climbed. He followed. He prayed he wasn't too late. But deep down, he knew. History does not wait for those who fall behind. Night settled over Alcatraz like a slow-moving tide, heavy and indifferent. The island, usually a monument of noise, metal and discipline, rested under a thin cloak of silence. Only the distant howl of the wind brushing against the rock reminded anyone awake that the world beyond still existed. For 3 men, that reminder was everything. For Alan West, trailing behind in desperation, it was a torment. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers moved through the narrow service corridor with the precision of men who had memorized every inch of it. Dust swirled around their hands as they crawled quietly through the dark shaft behind their cells. The smell of mildew and rust filled the air, smells familiar after countless nights of work. Clarence held the small waterproof bag against his chest. Inside it, the raft folded tight and flat like a compressed heart. John carried the paddles strapped to his side. Frank gripped his homemade periscope and a small light source fashioned from scavenged parts, dim enough to avoid detection, but bright enough to guide them. Every noise, every exhaled breath, every shifting knee against concrete was controlled. Above them, the old ventilation fan they had disabled weeks ago hung motionless, its silence a crucial advantage. Frank reached the crawl space first. He lifted his head slowly, letting the narrow beam from his small light scrape across the beams above. Nothing moved, no sound except the quiet hum of the building settling beneath them. He whispered, "Clear." The Anglin brothers climbed through, steady and synchronized, their movements smooth despite the adrenaline echoing through their veins. The attic above B-blocks spread before them, shadows swallowing every corner, wooden rafters stretching like ribs of some ancient creature. Dust rose in faint clouds around their hands, each particle drifting lazily in the dim light. Frank looked back at the opening they had emerged from. No Alan West. No sound of his climb, no whisper calling out, nothing. He closed his eyes for a moment, not out of fear, but out of understanding. They had waited as long as they could. West's absence was now a reality. Down below, West climbed through his vent in a frantic scramble. His heart hammered in his chest, not from exertion, though there was plenty of that, but from the crushing knowledge that he was behind. He reached the service corridor, scraped elbows pulling him forward. His breath caught as panic pushed against the edges of his resolve. But still he moved, faster, because after everything, after the nights, the dust, the whispered planning, failure wasn't something he could accept. He reached the crawl space opening and looked up. Darkness, quiet, nothing above except shadows. He whispered, barely audible, "Frank, John, Clarence." No answer. He swallowed hard and tried climbing. His hands slipped at first, sweat and dust mixing into a weak paste on his skin. His foot missed a ledge. His fingers trembled from fatigue, but he kept climbing. He reached the attic floor, but the others were already far ahead. He stood alone in the darkness, breathing hard, dust coating his hair and the front of his shirt. He wiped his face with a trembling hand and blinked against the sting of concrete grit in his eyes. For a brief moment, he considered continuing, running desperately towards the grate. Maybe they were still there. Maybe he could catch them. But something deep inside him knew the truth. He had missed the moment. He wasn't going to make the climb in time. Still, he whispered one more time into the hollow darkness, "Please, just wait." But silence was the only reply. Up in the attic, Frank led the Anglin brothers along the narrow beam pathway toward the wooden grate that stood between them and the open air. The grate hung loosely now, weakened by weeks of careful work. Its rusted screws sat crooked in their sockets. Frank approached it first. He placed both hands gently on the wood. It shifted beneath his touch. He lifted. It came free without a struggle, rising like a curtain pulled aside. A gust of cold night wind rushed into the attic, brushing their faces with the kind of air they hadn't felt in years. Ocean air, sharp, salty, raw. It carried the distant sound of waves slapping against the island's cliffs. For a moment, the three men simply stood there and breathed, not loudly, not greedily, just steadily, letting the air fill them with something they had almost forgotten existed: possibility. Frank leaned forward, using the periscope to look across the roofline. No guards, no lights sweeping the area. The sky above was a dark curtain of stars, with clouds passing slowly like drifting sails. He whispered, "We move." The roof of Alcatraz was colder than they expected. The concrete carried the night's chill, and wind whipped against them with surprising force. The Anglin brothers followed Frank across the flat rooftop, staying low, moving with smooth, practiced steps. Their shadows stretched long behind them, dancing across the surface in the dim ambient light. From their vantage point, the city of San Francisco glittered faintly in the distance, a cluster of lights shimmering like a mirage. To men who had seen nothing but steel bars and grey walls for years, it looked almost unreal. John whispered, That doesn't look far." Frank didn't answer. Not because he disagreed, but because he knew distance wasn't the enemy tonight. The cold was, the tides were, the darkness was, and one mistake could erase every step they had taken to reach this point. They moved to the north edge of the roof, the side facing the narrow patch of shoreline where they had planned to descend. Frank tested the weight of the pipe conduit again, making sure it was secure. They would climb down it quietly, carefully, and disappear into the shadows behind the workshops. He motioned for the Anglin brothers to follow. Clarence went first, gripping the pipe, his feet finding friction against the concrete wall as he lowered himself into darkness. John followed, Frank last. By the time their feet touched the ground, below, the wind shifted again, carrying the scent of low tide and the distant rhythmic crash of waves. They crouched low, checking the perimeter. Still no guards, still no movement. Frank whispered, "To the shoreline." They moved through shadows, staying close to the darker edges of the buildings. Their footsteps were slow, controlled, rolling heel to toe in practiced silence. Every few seconds, Frank paused to listen. Every distant clank of metal felt like a possible alarm. Every echo of wind felt like a guard clearing his throat. But the night was kind. No voices, no footsteps, no dogs, no sudden beams of light, only moonlit silence. They passed the workshops, the laundry building, the utility shed. Each structure stood dark and hollow, like sleeping beasts unaware of the men slipping past their shadows. When they finally reached the far side of the island, the narrow stretch of land closest to the water, the tide had receded enough to expose a jagged line of rocks. Waves slapped against them in a cold rhythm, breaking into white foam. The ocean didn't welcome them, it warned them. But the men were past warnings now. They quietly unrolled the raft. Moonlight caught the glossy surface of the raincoat rubber, illuminating it like something alive. Clarence whispered, "Still holds." John nodded. They unpacked the hand crank pump, built from scavenged vacuum cleaner parts. Frank wound the crank slowly at first, making sure the sound wasn't loud enough to draw attention. The raft expanded with each turn. The rubber wrinkled, smoothed, stretched, took shape. Their breaths fogged in the cold air as they worked. Minutes passed, then more, until the raft stood firm and ready. Frank tested the seams with gentle pressure. The Anglins secured the paddles, then tightened their life preservers. The shoreline stretched before them, lit by moonlight, sharp rocks sticking from the tide like warning fingers. Clarence stepped forward, eyes scanning the water. "This is it." Frank nodded once. John whispered, "Let's go." They lifted the raft together, careful not to scrape it across the rocks. The cold sprayed their faces, stealing their breath. For a moment, all three men paused, not from fear, but from the sudden realization that they were finally leaving the island. Not in dreams, not in planning, but in reality. Frank stepped into the raft first, holding it steady. The Anglins followed. The raft dipped under their combined weight, water sloshing against the sides. The current tugged at them immediately. Frank whispered, "Paddle on my count." The brothers grabbed their paddles. Frank steadied his. The raft drifted free of the rocks. The tide caught them. Frank gave the first command. 1. Their paddles sliced into the dark water. 2. A wave lifted them, rolling beneath the raft. 3. They began to move, slowly, steadily, away from the island, away from Alcatraz, away from the lives they were leaving behind. From the water, the rock looked almost peaceful, a black silhouette against the pale glow of the horizon. Its watchtowers stood like silent guardians, unaware of the 3 small figures drifting away on a raft built from raincoats. Frank kept his movements controlled, despite the cold biting through his clothing. He focused on the rhythm, not too hard, not too fast. Slow, deliberate strokes. The Anglin brothers matched him perfectly. Moonlight shimmered across the surface of the bay, painting silver streaks that danced with each wave. The raft glided through them, moving farther with every stroke. Behind them, Alcatraz became smaller, but in front of them, the open water seemed endless. The Golden Gate Bridge loomed faintly in the distance, a dark ribbon cutting across the sky. Beyond it, the open ocean waited, a place powerful enough to swallow whole ships. Their goal wasn't the ocean. Their goal was the opposite direction, the shadowed shoreline of Marin County. Frank whispered, "Keep to the right. Let the tide help." They angled the raft ever so slightly. The current shifted beneath them, and slowly they drifted toward freedom. Halfway across, the calmness broke. The wind picked up, sending ripples across the water that grew into small waves. The raft rocked, swaying with each rise and fall of the tide. The Anglins adjusted their paddles. Frank kept his pace steady. They had expected resistance. The bay never gave safe passage. Still, the raft held firm, its seams creaking but strong. John whispered, "Are we drifting off course?" Frank checked the faint outline of the shore. "No, we're still aligned." Clarence exhaled slowly. "Water's getting colder." Frank nodded. "Keep moving." They paddled harder. The raft dipped into deeper troughs. Salt water splashed their faces. The wind howled quietly around their ears, carrying flecks of foam and mist across their arms. But still they pressed on, stroke after stroke, breath after breath, until the lights of the city seemed closer than the towers behind them. At last, after what felt like an eternity, the dark outline of Marin's coastline began to take form. Trees stood like jagged silhouettes. Rocky shorelines shone faintly under the moon. They were close, closer than any escapee before them had ever been. Frank slowed his paddling. The brothers followed. Their raft drifted into the calmer shallows near the shoreline. Waves rolled gently beneath them, pushing them toward land. John whispered, "We made it." Frank didn't answer, not because he doubted, but because he wanted to hear the sound of the raft sliding onto sand, a sound no prisoner of Alcatraz had ever heard before. Moments later, it came. A soft scrape, a muffled drag. The raft touched land. They stepped out, legs unsteady, arms numb from cold and strain. But they were standing on free soil. Clarence whispered into the night, "We did it, Frank, we actually did it." Frank looked back at the bay, the distant shadow of Alcatraz fading behind silver waves. For a moment, the world felt impossibly quiet. Then he said the only words fitting for the moment. "Let's disappear before sunrise." Dawn approached slowly that morning, soft light brushing the edges of the Pacific horizon, as if the sun itself hesitated to rise over what had occurred. Alcatraz, a fortress built on certainty, had awakened to something it was never designed to face: uncertainty. 3 prisoners had vanished into the night. The Rock had always promised one thing to the public, to the courts, to the families of victims, to the prisoners themselves: no one escapes. But on June the 12th, 1962, that promise cracked. The morning count began like any other. Guards walked between the rows of cells, calling out names that had long been reduced to numbers. Sunlight slipped through the narrow windows, cutting pale stripes across the hallway. When the guard reached Frank Morris's cell, he tapped the bedframe with a baton. "Morris, up." The body didn't move. He tapped again, harder. "Morris, I said up." Still nothing. Annoyance shifted into suspicion. The guard leaned into the cell, extending his hand to shake the prisoner awake. His fingers gripped the head lightly, and the head rolled, fell, shattered on the floor. The guard stumbled backward, breath freezing in his throat. What lay before him was not a human face, but a mask, painted flesh tones, human hair, cold eyes that had never blinked. The guard's shout echoed like a gunshot. Within seconds, alarms wailed through the entire prison. Metal doors slammed. Guards sprinted into position. Keys clattered. Radios hissed to life. 2 more beds revealed the same nightmare. John Anglin gone. Clarence Anglin gone. 3 empty bunks, 3 dummy heads, 3 vanished men. The island erupted in motion. Floodlights swept across the yard. Guards stormed every corridor, checking shadows as if expecting escapees to materialize from thin air. But the prison was silent. No movement, no clues, no bodies. Only 3 holes cut behind the ventilation grills, holes carefully concealed by painted cardboard for months. The guards stood in disbelief. Warden Olin Blackwell arrived minutes later, his face a storm of disbelief and rising panic. He stared at the empty cells, the crude mask still lying on the concrete floor, scattered hair at its base. This doesn't make sense. But it did, just not to him. He turned sharply toward his officers. Find them. Every inch of this island, every building, every rooftop. Move. When guards reached the rooftop, they saw the evidence immediately. The loosened vent, footprints across the old concrete, a few stray fibers from a raincoat, a rusted pipe with fresh hand scrapes. The wind tugged at their uniforms as they leaned over the edge, peering down the wall to the rocky shoreline below. One guard clenched his jaw. They went this way. Another shook his head. No one survives that climb, but the evidence said otherwise. On the rocks below the north shore, investigators found a single wooden paddle, 2 pieces of raincoat rubber, a small scrap of fabric, a footprint in the mud, wide, deep, fresh. The tides had erased the rest. Coast Guard boats fanned out immediately, engines roaring across the morning waves. Helicopters hovered above, slicing the fog with spinning blades. Officers scanned the water for bodies, debris, motion, anything, but the bay was empty. No raft, no bodies, no trace. The ocean held its secrets tightly. By midday, reporters had gathered outside Alcatraz, their cameras ready, the nation watching. Warden Blackwell stood before them, jaw tight, suit sharp, eyes burning with exhaustion. At this time, he said, voice controlled but strained, there is no evidence the escapees survived. We believe they drowned in the currents. A reporter raised a hand. But you haven't found bodies. None, the warden admitted. The currents are powerful. Bodies may never surface. He knew the truth, however bitter. He didn't know what had happened. He couldn't know. Behind him, through the gates of the island, the lighthouse stood tall, its white tower gleaming in the sun, a silent witness to the impossible. The waters of the San Francisco Bay were infamous, cold enough to numb limbs within minutes, strong enough to pull even strong swimmers under, unpredictable, violent, unforgiving. The FBI concluded that no raft could have survived the currents, that no prisoner, no matter how determined, could have crossed that night. But those who had lived on the island, those who had watched the Anglin brothers swim laps in freezing water as if it were a game, those who had seen Frank's relentless discipline, they quietly disagreed. One prison guard said later, if anyone could have made it, it was them. Back in Florida, the Anglin family lived the years that followed in a strange mix of fear, hope, and unspoken truth. Their mother received fresh flowers every year on her birthday, always the same type, always unsigned. 2 cards, no handwriting, just roses. After her death in 1973, the flowers stopped, but the Christmas cards continued for several more years, each one signed with carefully printed names. John and Clarence, no return address, no postmark, no explanation. The FBI dismissed them as hoaxes. The family believed otherwise. One sister, years later, said with unwavering certainty, They were alive. We know they were alive. In 1975, far from US jurisdiction, two men stood in a rural field in Brazil, sun flickering across their weathered faces, their clothes dusty and worn. A man named Fred Brizzi, childhood friend of the Anglins, claimed he had taken that picture, that the men in it were none other than John and Clarence Anglin. Decades later, forensic, facial recognition experts would analyze the photo. Their conclusion: highly likely the men are the Anglin brothers. The FBI never officially accepted this, but they never disproved it either. Frank's fate is perhaps the most mysterious of all. Some say he drowned, unable to fight the current once separated from the brothers. Some say he made it, but chose a life so deeply hidden no trail remained. Others say he resurfaced briefly, once in Maryland, once near San Diego, before disappearing again. One alleged encounter described him as older, quieter, with a mustache and a tired kindness in his eyes. No one knows for sure. Frank had always been a ghost in life. In freedom, he may have simply become better at it. What began as a frantic manhunt slowly transformed into a long, winding mystery. For decades, agents conducted interviews, searched documents, chased rumors, reviewed evidence, considered confessions, examined photos, listened to desperate phone calls, reopened files, closed them again. The case was officially closed. Unofficially, it never slept. In 2013, the FBI received a letter allegedly written by one of the escapees. A trembling script claimed, "I am the last one alive. If you announce on TV that I will get medical treatment, I will turn myself in." The Bureau tested the handwriting, tested the ink, tested the paper. Inconclusive. Like everything else, whether the men lived or died, something undeniable emerged from their story. Alcatraz changed forever. The prison that once symbolized perfect control had been pierced. The myth of its inescapability shattered, not by a violent breakout, not by chaos, but by patience, intelligence, and quiet determination. Less than a year after the escape, in March 1963, Alcatraz closed its doors permanently. Many believe the escape accelerated that decision. Some say it caused it. Today, tourists walk through the same corridors where Morris and the Anglin brothers once whispered, planned, and dreamed. They peer into the same cells. They see the holes in the walls, the dummy heads, the artifacts, and every visitor asks the same question. Did they make it? Every theory, every clue, every whispered story tells its own version of the truth. And perhaps that's why the legend endures. The mystery belongs to everyone. When three men vanished into the night, they didn't just escape a prison. They escaped certainty. They escaped definition. They escaped history itself. Some believe they drowned within minutes. Some believe they reached Brazil and lived quiet lives under new names. Some believe Frank survived independently, wandering America like a phantom. Others believe they reunited years later and lived in peace until their final days. The truth may still be out there, hidden in an old letter, locked in a box of photographs, remembered in a fading memory, or buried under decades of silence. If you listen closely, even now, standing on the cliffs near Alcatraz, you can hear it. The waves, the wind, the silence. All three sound the same as they did that night, and somewhere within that silence, somewhere between the tide and the fog, drifts the unanswered question that still captivates the world. Did they escape, or did they vanish forever? Maybe that question is the very reason their story survives. Why even now, decades later, people feel a spark of curiosity, of hope, of wonder. As our story comes to its quiet end, let me leave you with something soft, something reflective. Three men risked everything for one moment of freedom. What would you have done in their place? Would you have stayed behind? Would you have taken the risk? Do you believe they survived the crossing? Or do you think the bay claimed them forever? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Every interpretation adds to the legend. You're welcome to share your own theory in the comments if you feel like it. For now, rest easy. Let the waves settle, let the story drift into calmness, and let the unanswered questions fade gently into the night. Thank you for listening. Until the next story, sleep well.